As I mentioned, there are over 200 people that have signed up for this event, and we're a little over half of that now. So as they come on, you may see your screens grow. So at this time, I'm going to ask the Honorable Richard Gergel to introduce our guests. And we do accept questions. Please send them to me personally, Lily Filler, and I will do my very best to ask all of these questions and combine those that are very similar to our guests. So with that, Judge Gergel, please take it over.
Thank you very much, Lily. This is another of our periodic webcasts of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina, hosted by myself and Robert Rosen. Robert, hello. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. I've learned a lot about Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
That's right. We're going to discuss today that very subject, the remarkable legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And we're going to do it with her dear friend of 50 years, Professor Leon Friedman. Leon will also share with us, after we talk about Justice Ginsburg and his relationship with her, we're going to talk about his parents' remarkable story from Pamplico, South Carolina, where they were merchants for many years. Just by way of background, Leon is a longtime professor at the Hofstra Law School, where he holds an endowed chair, and he continues to be an active litigator in major civil rights, civil liberties, and intellectual property litigation across the United States. He represented James Brown, Nobel laureate I.B. Singer, and many other noted authors, entertainers, and artists. He famously was the lawyer who sprung Hurricane Carter from jail, and the movie The Hurricane, starring Denzel Washington, featured Leon's role in this important litigation. He also authored many books on American legal history, including an award-winning book on the justices of the United States Supreme Court. So the question is, how did I get Leon Friedman to come on a Sunday afternoon to this webcast? Well, it wasn't that hard. He is my cousin. Isn't that always the truth for all Jewish families? You'll always have someone who's a cousin who can help you. And Leon has been just a great friend. We represented many clients together over years. We tried cases together when I was a litigator, including we represented Mr. Brown for over a decade, James Brown for over a decade in state and federal courts. And so with that, welcome Leon to our webcast.
Thank you very much, Richard.
For the moment, I want to skip over your South Carolina story. We'll get to that, but I think our audience here first would love to hear about, about how we'll sort of begin with your college days and then how that took you into working for the American Civil Liberties Union and your relationship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Why don't you share that with us?
Well, Ruth and I call her Ruth, she calls me Leon, so I feel very comfortable about that. We were at law school together. I was in the Army after I graduated from college, and she followed her husband, Marty, down to Fort Sill in Oklahoma because he was drafted after college. But at any rate, Marty entered law school in 1957. She entered in 1958, and I entered in, he entered in 1956 because he graduated, 55, he graduated in 58. She entered in 56 and graduated, well, she spent 2 years and then went down to Columbia for her last year. And I started in 1957. So there was 1 year where all three of us were in the at law school together. I met her at various occasions, and she was going through a very difficult time. Marty had got a cancer designation and couldn't go to a lot of classes. So she had to take notes from other law students, which she typed up to give to her husband. And she had this little girl, Jane, at that time, who was 2 or 3 years old. And the way she tells it, I spent the first half of my day working for Marty. Then from 4 o'clock till 8 o'clock, I took care of my daughter. And from 8 o'clock till midnight, I worked on my own. And the result was she joined the Harvard Law Review. I mean, she started in 1956. Women were admitted to the Harvard Law School in 1950 for the first time. And in her class, there were 500 men and 9 women. And she made law review. when Marty got a job in New York in 1950, when he graduated in 1958, she wanted to go to New York with him and still get a Harvard degree, just transfer her last year. And Harvard had a system where if you had a compelling personal reason to have your last year in another school and still get a Harvard degree, they would allow it. And she explained to Dean Griswold she wanted to be with her husband. And he looked at her and says, we don't consider that a compelling personal reason. So she
was, I think, wasn't she number one in her class at Harvard and then went to Columbia and was number one in her class?
In both. And when she graduated in 59, she looked around for a job in New York. Not a single law firm would offer her a job. Not a single law firm. Now, it's not only the fact that she was a woman, but she was a Jewish woman. Because in those days, the large Wall Street firms would not take Jews. There were half a dozen Jewish law firms that would take, the law review people. I mean, in my class, of the top 60 people, 40 were Jewish. Not one got an offer at a Jewish law firm, at one of the Wall Street law firms. And there were half a dozen, very capable law firms. Marty joined one of them. Who would accept Jewish lawyers. So she had a double problem when she was looking for a job. She was a woman and she was Jewish and couldn't get a job in New York, even though she graduated number one in her class. So she got a job clerking for a district court judge. I mean, her professor, Jerry Gunther, called up Frankfurter. Why not? And he said, no, it's not time for a woman to be a Supreme Court clerk. So at any rate, she got a job first as a clerk for a district court judge. Then she had a job studying the Swedish legal system for 2 years. And she did not take Jane with her. Jane was at home with Marty, who took care of all the domestic affairs. And then when she came back,
Leon, can I interrupt you?
Sure.
Let me ask you something. I was reading about her connection to Sweden, which I thought was very interesting. So, some people seem to think that her living in Sweden influenced her view that society could have more equality between the sexes. What do you think about that?
I'm sure that's true. She certainly knew that there was not equality in the United States, and she compared that to what she was learning in Sweden. So I'm sure that inspired her to push harder, to eliminate all of the discrimination that we have here.
So she returns from Sweden, and what does she do after that?
She started teaching at Rutgers.
Okay.
And while she's at Rutgers, the New Jersey Civil Liberties Union got in touch with her, a few cases that she worked on. And then in 1970, she started working with the American Civil Liberties Union. In
New York.
In New York, whose headquarters were in New York. First, she was still teaching at Rutgers, but working at the ACLU rather than New Jersey. She, started with Reed v. Reed, this Idaho case, which was the first, start of the whole road towards eliminating gender discrimination. And then in 1972, the ACLU set up the Women's Rights Project, and she was the head of it. So from 1970 to and I was a lawyer at the ACLU at the time. So she would teach at Columbia and then come down to 40th Street where we had our offices. And, there were 5 permanent lawyers there, and we would all discuss our different cases. And she had a theory. She had a theory about what to do. And her theory was, you start with the worst gender discrimination cases, attack it, and work up ladder by ladder. You don't get to the end. You don't attack, the Virginia Military Institute wouldn't allow women in. You do it step by step. All of the hundreds and hundreds of discrimination in the Army, the military, and Social Security, old age benefits. Everywhere you turned, the tax laws, we know from the Moritz case, everywhere you turned women, you stay home and take care of the kids, we work. So why do we have to give you money? Or we'll give you some extra money, but we'll continue to discriminate against you. So she
Leon, can you walk us through, Leon, can you walk us through the cases? This is not a legal audience, but I think people would be interested in the major cases, starting with Reed, and explain what that was about and what her strategy was and how it developed.
All right. Just to give you a background, there were 20 cases that started in the Supreme Court between 1970 and 1980. In 1980, she became a Court of Appeal judge. Of the 20 cases, in how many did Ruth Bader Ginsburg participate? 16 out of 20. And there were 6 cases that she argued before the Supreme Court personally, and then she wrote briefs in the other 10. But I mean, Reed was a case where if a parent died without a will and no executor was appointed, and there was a brother and a sister, 2 persons of equal sanguinity, as we describe them in the law, then the boy, the son, would become the administrator of the estate. If there were 2 boys who survived a parent, they would be joint administrators. But if there was a boy and a girl, the law required that the boy be the sole administrator. Why? Why would anyone pass such a law? Because men know about money and women don't. They're at home taking care of the kids. So that was the start.
She won that case. I think Justice Berger wrote that decision, right?
That's correct. I mean, she wrote the brief. She didn't argue that case. Then Frontiero.
Leon, wasn't that the first case in American history where the Supreme Court used the Equal Protection Clause to talk about discrimination against women?
Correct. In the old days, there was a law against women being a lawyer, and the Supreme Court said, oh, that's okay. Women shouldn't be lawyers. It's highly contentious, and they should be home taking care of the kids. And they couldn't work in a bar unless their father or their husband owned the bar. So there were blanket discrimination as well as, monetary discrimination. I mean, Kahn v. Shevin was a case where women got extra estate tax benefits. Why were they given extras? Because they couldn't get jobs. They didn't have as much money as their male. And her answer was, well, thank you very much. Let me, give me an extra job, then I don't need the extra estate tax benefit. Godoldig against Aiello was a case where California pension plan would not allow women to get credit for the time when they were working when they were pregnant. And the court said, well, it's not a discrimination against all women, it's only a discrimination against pregnant women, and therefore it isn't gender discrimination. And there are 2 such cases in the Supreme Court which he attacked. Weinberger against Weisenfeld was a case where if one parent died and there was a survivor, the women would get, if the woman's husband died, she would get all kinds of extra benefits for taking care of the child. But if the wife died, the husband would not. Why not? Well, he's working, he's the one working, and therefore, he doesn't need these extra benefits. So again and again, Edwards against Healy was a case, women on a jury. We don't want, women could choose to be on a jury. They don't have to be on a jury.
Leon, so she was doing was she was attacking things that even seemed to benefit women in a sort of, discriminatory way. She would attack it because she says, I don't want your charity. I want equality.
That's correct. Exactly right. And then, there was one Frontiero against Richardson about women in the Army who could not be, a man has to be promoted every 2 years, but women didn't have to be promoted until they were in the Army for 20 years. Why? Oh, you women in the Army, you don't really match together, so we'll give you a break. She didn't want any breaks. She wanted all laws that discriminated on the basis of gender. And she did it. She had a plan, going up the road, a woman must be, there were 20 cases. Woman must be 5'2" and weigh 120 pounds to work in prison. Why? Well, because prison is a very tough job and they have to be physically correct. Suppose they're working as a clerk in some office, they don't really come into contact with the prisoners. That was not enough. As I say, 20 cases like this down the line.
Leon, tell us about the case that was in the movie. The movie that probably everybody saw, On the Basis of Sex, but that involved the tax issue that her husband was involved in. What was that?
That's another, the Moritz case. That came after Reed. I know the movie suggested that was her first case. It was her second case. Reed had already been decided. But Marty was a tax lawyer, and he said there's this funny tax lawyer that allow people to take deductions for taking care of a parent, and all women could take these deductions, but not all men could take these deductions. Only if a man himself had been married. If a man had never been married, he couldn't take any deduction for taking care of his mother. Why? Well, because if he was married, the women would tell him, how to take care of an older person, but he wouldn't know that on his own. So again and again, we have these assumptions about the way in which men and women operate in society, and laws passed on the basis of those assumptions.
Leon, one of the things was that Justice Ginsburg, as a lawyer, looked at this broad array of discriminatory laws. I mean, they were so vast. And then she really kind of identified the most egregious ones, and then incrementally brought her suits year after year, building one precedent on top of another.
Well, it was very difficult. She, knew the landscape. I mean, she didn't handle the lower court cases, so she knew how to contact other lawyers who had worked on the other cases and said, look, at the ACA, we'd like the women's rights, we'd like to help you. And when they got to the Supreme Court role, they lost below, she knew how to file a cert petition. And once it was granted, sometimes she argued the case and sometimes she didn't. But there were so many assumptions. California had a pension plan, and it depended on, how many years you worked and how many years you would rely on the pension. Well, women all live longer than men. They live on an average of 5 or 6 times longer than men. So therefore, they should pay more into their pension plan when they were working, because not all women live longer. The average of women live longer. But that's another example. That's City of Los Angeles versus Manhart. And she wrote the brief in that case. Leon,
people are kind of fascinated with her relationship with her husband. Talk about Marty a little bit.
Marty was listen, if you sat down and had dinner with them, which we did many times, she would talk for 5 minutes and he would talk for an hour. He was very open, very collegial. And she was, she would just sit there and listen and answer any question anybody had. But she sort of, devoted herself to her work and her thoughts about her work. And, she sort of left it to him to do the socializing. And he was a very funny guy. He supported her in every way. He brought her into this Moritz case, when she got interested in the judgeship. He was the one that went around and knocked on doors, both for a Court of Appeals judgeship and then in 1993 for the Supreme Court. He was a wonderful man. You just loved being with him. I spent 3 months with him, with a month with Ruth and Marty, and he was always there.
Explain that. How do you happen to spend? This was after she was on the Supreme Court.
This was at Hofstra. We have a summer program, and we arranged for the program to be held in Nice and in Sorrento. Guess what? Supreme Court justices like to go to nice summer places. And so therefore, 3 years we had Ruth Ginsburg, and 3 years we had Scalia. He was in my class at law school, so I did know him. And we would teach a course on comparative constitutional law. And, we would hang around with each other, before.
This would be
after
1
class.
month at a time. You would be with the Ginsburg. I take it Marty was there?
Always Marty was there, I can assure you. Every time she went on one of these summer events, she was there. Now, earlier in the summer,
Leon, tell us about her and Marty's relationship with the Jewish community and how much she identified or how observant she was. What is her real connection with the Jewish religion in your view?
well, number one, she gave a very famous speech at the Holocaust Museum in 2004. And she talked about her father who came over from, her father came over from Odessa, and her mother was the first, the family came over from Poland. Let me just see. And her mother was the first member of the family born here. And, I guess we all know the story. Her mother died the day that she graduated from high school. And the way she tells it, my heritage as a Jew and my occupation as a Jew fit together. The demand for justice runs through the entirety of Jewish history and Jewish tradition. I take pride in and draw strength from my heritage. As signs in my chamber attest, the large silver mezuzah on my doorpost, a gift from the Shumalith School for Girls in Brooklyn, and on Three Worlds, an artist rendition, Sedek, Sedek, Tidot, justice, justice shall you pursue. So she felt that her sense of injustice, when she was a woman and couldn't get a job, that also followed from the Jewish tradition where Jews were discriminated against everywhere they went. So she thought of it,
Leon, how about the relationship with the kids? You knew the kids growing up?
Jane?
Yes.
Well, I knew Jane. I mean, I didn't know them growing up. Jane was a professor got to be a professor at Columbia Law School. She got a copyright expert.
So the two of y'all are doing the
That's
same
correct.
thing.
And we communicated that way because I also taught a copyright. And I'm sure Jane helped Ruth whenever a copyright case came before the Supreme Court. But then talk a little bit about their domestic life. I mean, Marty kind of ran the house, did the cooking. Ran the house, did the cooking, did all the cooking.
Raised the kids?
I'm sure he did. I mean, she went to Sweden for 2 years. What was happening to Jane at that time? And Marty was taking care of it. He had no hesitation, in helping her. And he was prepared to do whatever he had to in order to ensure that she could follow, what she was following her.
And he, just not an oversight on him, he was like one of America's premier tax lawyers, correct?
He was. He taught, he had a job in a very important, he was a tax partner in New York. When she came to the Supreme Court, he came down, first got a job teaching at Georgetown, and then he connected with another firm in Washington. So he was doing, he was doing his work and doing it very well.
And we've talked about her life as a lawyer. Can you talk about what impact she had on the law as a judge? Because before the Supreme Court, she was on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, correct?
D.C. Circuit. Well, her big case is the Virginia Military Institute case, where as we from South Carolina because you had the same problem with what's the military academy in South Carolina? The Citadel. I'm sorry, I skipped that. But women weren't allowed. Why not? Why not? Number one, privacy issues. Number two, it's really tough. You have to do things, and women don't have the wherewithal to respond to orders and going into the field and doing things. And, you know, as I say, you can't imagine a situation that seems less feminine than going in, or less female than going into the army, but she was determined. If a woman wants to do it, that's in her opinion. I know this is going to be tough for people to do it, but if a woman wants to do it, we must let her do it. We can't let the law stand in her way. You know, she wrote this big dissent in the Ledbetter case, where if a woman was receiving a different wage but didn't know about it, I mean, do people tell everyone else what we're making? So they're two people of exactly the same status in a business, and does one necessarily know what the other is doing? And the Supreme Court said, oh yes, you know, she worked for 20 years and didn't get the same. She should have brought an action earlier. And, you know, Ruth, in her dissent, said, I hope Congress does something about this. That's ridiculous to interpret the law that way. So what is the first law that Congress passed in the new Obama administration? The Lilly Ledbetter Act, which totally, you know, changed the law. It's not when, you know, when the difference is when the person discovers the difference. So, you know, she did, you know, she was very important in that. You know, there were all kinds of.
In one of the cases in the Supreme Court, what do you think her legacy, her other than VMI, what do you see as her major cases?
Well, there was a Thompson case where the office, the company would fire the fiance of an employee who brought a gender discrimination case. So the woman brought the case. They couldn't fire her because that would be anti-retaliation. So they fired a fiance. You know, that's the way things go. The sessions.
Leon, she was sort of the Thurgood Marshall of the gender movement, correct?
That's
Both
correct.
I
mean, in the way that,
yeah, and then as a judge.
Well, in the same way that Thurgood Marshall brought all the cases and argued the cases, Brown v. Board of Education, obviously, that led to race discrimination being unconstitutional. She brought, as I say, 20 cases. She does 17 of them. She works on 17 of those cases. I'm sorry, 16 out of 20 cases. That's amazing. Now, when she got to the Supreme Court, you know, I remember we were just, women are treated differently as far as citizenship is concerned. There were a few cases in which the child of a woman born abroad becomes a citizen, but the child of the father born abroad is not automatically a citizen. They have to prove it. I remember in class, she asked them, why should women and men be treated differently as far as the citizenship of their child is concerned? So some woman raised her hand. Mothers maybe, mother's baby, father's maybe. So she would handle a lot of these cases. You know, I have a list: Sessions against Morales, Santama, different test for citizenship of a child, of U.S. versus woman. I mean, those favored women, again, because the child of a woman would of a U.S. citizen would automatically, but she didn't want all these extra benefits, any gender discrimination in the law.
Leon, I don't think any of our audience knows the backstory of your family coming to South Carolina, and we are the Jewish Historical Society. And you couldn't make it up. So share with us your parents' journey to South Carolina.
Well, number one, how are Richard and I related? Well, my grandfather and his great-grandfather were brothers. There were 3 Friedman brothers in
Grave, Poland.
Grave, Poland,
thank you.
which was very near Eastern Prussia. my grandfather was killed in a pogrom in Russia. Richard's great-grandfather Meyer came to South Carolina. He had 7 children. They had 7 children, and there are an awful lot of descendants, many of whom went into the, what does a Jew do in South Carolina? You do buy a dry goods store. That's what Jews used to do. And my father and Richard's grandfather, Sam, were very close. And he had a job, I will disclose this, he was a high official in the Communist Party until 1945. And he was kicked out. Earl Browder, who was then the head of the Communist Party, wanted to make it into a political organization and not a revolutionary organization. And Moscow didn't want that to happen, kicked him out, kicked my father out. At first, he had a job with my mother's brothers. It was an upholstery shop in Massachusetts. That didn't work out. So what does he do? He goes to his family, goes to Sam. Sam teaches him how to run a dry goods store, 6 months. And then they look around for a dry goods store somewhere in South Carolina. And here's little Pamplico, 20 miles from Florence, 500 people. And my father buys the Pamplico department store. And he was there from 1947 till 1974.
And
And
so tell a little bit about his experience in Pamplico.
well, number one, the FBI, which follows all the people at high levels of the Communist Party, they come and start talking to all of his neighbors, the bank and everybody else, and said, is he talking revolutionary talk? And they say, no, he joined the Masons, he's part of our community. And I have an FBI report I got from the Freedom of Information, said, he has fitted into the community and there's no talk of revolution. And because the FBI was then, the Southern people didn't like the FBI. So the fact that the FBI came and asked questions, that somehow endeared them to the public. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so he was, if anything, he was.
They like the FBI less than they like communists.
That's correct.
So then your mother was like very involved in the community, particularly in the library. Tell about that.
Well, no, she was, my mother was very open and made friends with everybody. And there was and she thought up the idea that this little town should have a library. I mean, otherwise they have to go 20 miles into Florence to get a library. So there was a big company, I forget the name of it, Stevens or something like that. Yeah. Was an upholstery company or something? Textile company, that's right. And she said, why don't they contribute to a library, and persuaded them to put up the money. And she told this little committee we should have a Black person on the committee, and they agreed. And so someone came on, and eventually the library was built. And there is a dedication to Fanny Friedman for having been the inspiration.
Well, I attended the naming of the library for her.
That's correct.
With you and your sister.
That's correct. They
I went to Pamplico many times and visited them. They were like the most mainstream part of the community. I mean, people loved them. Everybody knew them. They had the major store downtown. I mean, it was an amazing thing.
They were accepted over a period of time, and the FBI visit helped. They were accepted into the community.
And they were also very involved in the synagogue in Florence.
That's true. They would go there for all the holidays. They would go into Florence. So they did have some connection with the local Jewish community.
Richard, I wanted to ask Leon a little bit about how she got on the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had been on the Court of Appeals, and apparently it was a part of her personality in which she seemed to get along pretty well with the conservatives, not just Scalia, but Robert Bork when she was on the Court of Appeals. Can you talk about that at all?
Well, she knew how to get along. You know, when you're working as a judge with a bunch of other people, you have to know, you know, what appeals to them and what doesn't appeal to them. And she was very good at that right from the very beginning. So she, you know, the fact that she, you know, had this close connection with Scalia. Now, they didn't vote together on a lot of cases, but she was able to talk to them and, you know, and have her opinion considered. So, and I'm sure she did that while she was on the DC circuit. So she was there for 13 years.
Yeah, I read somewhere that one of the people who suggested her for the Supreme Court was Utah Republican Senator Orrin Hatch. Do you remember anything about that?
They were friends. I have to tell you a little. I have to tell you a little story.
It's so unusual.
I have to tell you a little story. When she was 80 years old, I and a colleague wrote an article about her in the National Law Journal called Ruth Ginsburg, Equality's Architect. And I sent her a copy, and she has a note. I mean, you know, I have this little note from Ruth Ginsburg. And she says, Orrin Hatch told me about your article. I said, how come Orrin Hatch? And she said, we're friends. You know, we've known each other for a long time. So it was Orrin Hatch that in this little note, Orrin Hatch, exclamation point, you know, told me about your article, and I want to thank you for making this such a wonderful day.
Leon, you know, I'll tell the story that in the 90s, Belinda and I went to a program at the US Supreme Court, and we were in one of those gilded meeting rooms they have there. And it was supposed to start about 6:30. And of course, we're country come to city. So we show up about 5 after 6. We want to be late. And we go into this room and it's empty. For everybody, the only person there is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's there early. And she's wearing white gloves and white pearls. I'm sure you saw her like this many times. And I went over to her and I said, Justice Ginsburg, I am Leon Friedman's cousin. And she said, are you from South Carolina?
Well, we talked about our families.
That was her first question. So then the room started filling up and Justice Scalia came in the room. And she yelled across the room, Nino, I guess that was his nickname for her. Nino, this is Leon's cousin, not Leon Friedman. This is Leon's cousin. Justice Scalia came over and says, are you from South Carolina?
Well, we talk about our families, you know, and so that's the way it was done.
But, you know, my impression of her is, you know, we know her today, and the kids know her as the notorious, you know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And yeah, you know, and she was so tough on dissent. But it seems like in her career, in the early years at least, some people refer to her as a cautious justice. In other words, she seemed to be someone trying to build a consensus with the conservatives.
Well,
Can you address that?
Well, it's true. You know, the way in which she developed the gender discrimination cases, you know, step by step, one ridiculous one after another, till you get to the end point. And she thought that's the way it should have been done with the, you know,
Roe versus Wade.
With the abortion cases, Roe v. Wade, with the right to die cases. You don't get to the end of the road. You work yourself up there. I have to tell you, the last time I saw her, I brought my class down every year. For 20 years, I would bring my class down. They would watch an argument. We would do a tour of the court, and Ruth would spend an hour with my class. To them, it was the high point. To this day, this is the high point of their career. But the last time I saw her, there was a play in New York called What the Constitution Means to Me. And she came up, and I was told by Kathleen Paradas, who worked with her, she's going to be here on this Saturday night. So I came. When Ruth walked into that theater, the place went crazy for 15 minutes. Scream, yell, whatever. No one in the world could have produced that result. Why is she notorious LBJ, because people realized how that she was a very successful, but successful in the best sense of making the law, of changing the law. She did a great good to this country, and she worked very hard at it, and she deserves our, praise and adulation. And people realize that. And that's why she had this, all of this, I can only describe it as adulation for the last couple of years.
Lily, let's open it up to some questions.
Sure. I've got a couple of very intriguing questions. One, did Justice Ginsburg ever consider retirement during the Obama administration?
Well, there's this famous lunch that she had with Obama in 2013 when people could see what was happening. And she was, it came up in one way or another, what are your plans? Well, I'm going to stay here as long as I'm capable of doing this. She just felt she had done something important in the law and she wanted to keep doing it. So, 2013, that's 7 years ago.
Right. Okay, very interesting. There was another question about her relationship with her children. In a couple of the movies and what we saw during her funeral is they seem to take sort of a back seat. Can you talk a little bit more about her two children, Jane and her son, and what their relationship was or grew into?
Well, as I say, she went away to Sweden for 2 years on her project. She came back in the summers or whatever, and Marty was taking care of Jane. So, somehow they had worked out this relationship where, if necessary, he would come in and do whatever had to be done for the family, and she could pursue what she was, the path she was following. So, but she and Jane certainly were very close. There's no doubt about it. And David, her son, well, he had something to do with music, and now
Classical music, yeah, he has like a classical music company or something like that.
So he ran a classical music company.
Yeah.
I didn't really know him. I knew Jane because we worked together on copyright law. But one of the summers, her grandchildren came, and she was very close to them, So we got to meet her two grandchildren, but Jane's children. But I didn't, I wasn't around when she was. Other than that, I didn't see her with her two children.
Did she ever mention anything to you, or did you ever see anti-Semitism creep into either her personal or her professional world?
Well, I am sure she felt that one of the reasons she didn't get a job was because she was Jewish. She didn't really talk about that. She had plenty to talk about as far as gender discrimination is concerned. That was her focus. But she certainly was aware, she gave this very long speech at the Holocaust, taking into account, she certainly was aware of both her parents came here because of discrimination in the home countries. Both her mother's family and her father's family came here. So she certainly was aware of it and, fought against it in everything that she did. And that's all I know about it.
But nothing overt that she ever mentioned to you or that became an issue?
I can't remember anything.
Okay. There was a question about some of the cases that she took on. Were the states that those cases were from, was it predominantly Northeast, South, West, or could it have been any one of the 50 states?
Could have been anywhere. Could have been anywhere. I mean, she didn't just take state cases. There were a bunch of federal cases that she had to appeal. But like I say, there were so many laws. You know, so many Social Security laws, old age pension laws. Everyone assumed that the man would work and the woman would stay home and take care of the children, and they built the financial pension plans or old age plans or survivor plans on that basis. And she had to pick one by one, you know, which ones are the best to attack, which ones really show the bias in the worst possible way. And, you know, it was a plan. It was a strategy as bad as a military, well, as broad as a military strategy. Which case do you take now? Which case do you do it? How can I get the lawyers in this case to let me handle the case in the Supreme Court? And she did it again and again. I mean, you know, people knew the Weisenfeld case, this, you know, when a parent dies and you don't get any tax credits for taking care of the child. The male in that case, the mother died on childbirth, and the father knew that she was at Columbia and knew that she was handling gender discrimination. So he writes her a letter. She immediately takes the case. And by the way, the boy that was in that case later became a lawyer. And when he got married, who did he ask to be the judge to preside at his wedding? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who made his life possible because he won the case for her father.
Going toward the end of her life, did she belong to the synagogue? The rabbi who officiated, her husband apparently was affiliated or involved with Justice Ginsburg. Did she belong to the synagogue of that rabbi?
I really don't know. I'm afraid I don't know. She did.
And a question was also asked personally. Could you share with us when was your last conversation or interchange with Justice Ginsburg, and how long ago was that?
Well, in 2019, I took my class there, and then at the end of the year is when I went to the theater, and and when everyone then, and my wife is an artist, and drew some pictures, had some pictures. We were both in Nice together, and my wife Gail did some drawings down there. And Ruth was walking down the aisle. I said hello. We exchanged a few words, and she saw my wife, and she said, "Gail, your picture is hanging up in my bedroom." So that was the last time we saw her.
The last year.
That last year.
Very good. Richard, that's about all the questions we've had thus far.
I cannot have Leon Friedman not tell the greatest law story of all time. I have had him tell it to a variety of lawyer and judge groups, and it's the springing of Hurricane Carter. It is a great story. Leon, share it in just a few minutes with us, because it's obviously the basis of the movie, The Hurricane.
This is Paterson, New Jersey, which had a lot of race problems. And on a certain day in 1965, a white man goes into a black bar, a bar run by a black man, and they were having a money dispute, and he shoots him, kills him. Later that night, two black men walk into a white bar in Paterson, New Jersey, and kill 3 people. In the meantime, and the description of a couple of eyewitnesses, there were 2 black men in a white car that drove away. Well, Reuben Hurricane Carter was jumping around from different bars in Paterson, New Jersey, and he was stopped, but there were 3 black men in the white bar, so they let him go. But then, terrible thing happened. One of the black men walked away, so now there are 2 black men in a white bar. And the authorities A second policeman said, stop a white car with two black men. And they bring him back to the bar. Now, present at the bar where it happened was a crook who, after the shooting, had gone in and robbed the cash register. And he saw the police take these two black men, Reuben and this other black man, John Artis. And, you know, they took him to a hospital where the survivor was. And he said, no, these weren't the men. In the meantime, the authorities then want to arrest this black crook, a man named Bello. And he said, wait a minute, I have something to tell you. The person, I saw the people come out of the bar, and it was Reuben Carter and that other black man. So in order to avoid arrest, he suddenly made up this myth.
Now, Leon, let me just stop you long enough. Who is Reuben Hurricane Carter?
Who was he?
Yes.
He was
what was he at this time?
He was the leading contender for the middleweight championship.
He was a boxer.
He was a boxer.
World renowned, right? And he lived in Patterson, New Jersey.
Correct. So anyway, on the basis of this crook who made a deal with the authorities to avoid charges, he testifies against Reuben. And there were two trials. There was a reversal on the first one and then a retry. And this crook, Bello, changes his stories again and again. But he's eventually convicted a second time. And I was brought in as an appeal. The two lawyers who were representing him at trial was sort of tapped out. And I took the appeal to the New Jersey Supreme Court. And then we went into federal court. And a federal judge, whose name was Lee Sarakin in New Jersey, heard the story about how the authorities said this was racial revenge. There was no basis for it. And he reverses we had to, I filed a 250-page brief. And the judge later on said this was the best brief he had ever seen. We had to deal with a lot of different situations. And he granted a writ of habeas corpus.
How many years had Hurricane Carter been in prison at that time?
From 1965 to 1985, 20 years.
And then tell the story about his relationship with Judge Sarakin after he got released.
He was released on November 7, 1985. And every year on November 7, Reuben would call up Judge Sarakin, who for a while was a Court of Appeals judge, and then he retired, went to California, and Reuben somehow got his telephone number. And every year he would call him up. And in the last year, in 2013, he called in April. And Judge Sarakin says, why are you calling me now? He said, well, I'm dying of cancer and I don't have more than a day to live. And I wanted your voice to be the last voice I heard before I died. And Judge Carter had a podcast where he reports on different things. And he reports on this relationship with Reuben. And he said, one of the things he sent me a picture of a big fish that he had caught. And Reuben said, without you, this fish would still be alive.
And with that,
I think that's a great way to end the thing, Lily.
That's a great way to end the program. I want to thank everyone who have been on this cast to join us every time we have a program. We so much enjoyed having you. And I particularly want to recognize Rachel Barnett. If you'd raise your hand, Rachel, so that everybody knows this is our executive director and she does all the logistics for this. So Rachel, thank you so much. Richard and Robert, I want to thank you guys so much for what you do. And Leon, it is an absolute pleasure. We'd love to listen to you all day long, if we could, about your different stories. And not being a lawyer, I find this very fascinating for me. For those that are society members, I want to remind you that we have a business meeting on Sunday, October 18th at 11 o'clock in the morning. Please bring your coffee and bagels to be with us on that day. And we will see Richard and Robert again on November 1st at 5:30, where we are commemorating Charleston's 350 years, Charleston's Jews, and the city's notable history of religious tolerance. We'll have Judge Gergel and Robert Rosen again, and they'll be joined by the artist Jonathan Green and Councilman Peter Shahid. Until then, everyone, please be safe. Please sign up for our newsletters. Please sign up to see our Facebook page, and please sign up to be a member of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina. Thank you all very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.